September 1, 1943. Rabaul Airfield on New Britain Island lay heavy under the tropical heat as Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai reviewed the latest intelligence summary. With his remaining eye, the other lost the previous year to American defensive fire, he read a brief report describing a newly introduced U.S. Navy fighter. According to the document, the Americans had unveiled a machine so large and so heavy that it resembled a light bomber more than a frontline interceptor. The report named it the Hellcat. Its estimated weight, analysts claimed, was nearly double that of the Mitsubishi A6M Zero. Sakai chuckled, amused at what he assumed was yet another example of American misinterpretation of aerial warfare. Through the tent's open flaps, he could see rows of Zeros positioned on the airstrip's steel planking, slender, agile aircraft whose design philosophy emphasized extreme lightness above all else. For 2 years, these fighters had carved through Allied air forces with remarkable ease. British Hurricanes, American P-40s, and Dutch Brewster Buffaloes had all proven helpless when forced into turning combat with the Zero. To Sakai and the aviators gathering for the morning briefing, the bulky Hellcat seemed destined to join that same list of failed opponents. What none of them realized was that a month later, the aircraft they were dismissing would begin dismantling Japanese naval aviation on a scale never before seen. In the months that followed its introduction to combat, the Grumman F6F Hellcat would record a kill ratio of roughly 19 victories for every loss, ultimately accounting for 5,223 enemy aircraft destroyed while losing only 270 in air-to-air engagements. Its arrival would reshape carrier operations, shatter Japan's aerial strength, and expose the weaknesses hidden beneath the Zero's earlier triumphs. Within half a year, many of the pilots who laughed that morning would face the Hellcat in battle. Few would return. For them, the statistical advantage the Zero had once enjoyed would reverse so dramatically that encounters with Hellcats came to represent near certain death. The rising sun emblem that once symbolized dominance in the Pacific now marked aircraft that were rapidly losing their edge. The Japanese Navy's confidence in late 1943 was not merely bravado, it was the result of numbers that had seemed irrefutable. From the attack on Pearl Harbor onward, Japanese aviators had achieved success rates that stunned observers. At Pearl Harbor, they sacrificed just 29 aircraft while disabling or destroying more than 300 American planes on the ground. In the Philippines, they lost 7 aircraft while downing over 100. During the attack on Darwin, only 2 Japanese aircraft were shot down compared to 30 Allied losses. Entire regional air arms, British, Dutch, American, had collapsed in the face of this onslaught. At the heart of these overwhelming victories was the Mitsubishi A6M Zero, an aircraft whose capabilities had surprised even the Allied engineers who later examined captured examples. In early 1942, American test pilots and analysts initially refused to accept the performance data in front of them. The Zero possessed operational range rivaling that of medium bombers, maneuverability reminiscent of pre-war biplanes, and armament capable of tearing through nearly any opponent it managed to bring into its sights. To many, its performance seemed beyond what contemporary engineering should have allowed. But the era in which the Zero's strengths went unchallenged was ending, and the arrival of the Hellcat would expose how deeply Japan's earlier air superiority had depended on assumptions that no longer held true. Warrant Officer Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, later celebrated as Japan's leading fighter ace with 87 confirmed victories, left behind a diary that gives rare insight into how pilots viewed the Zero. In one entry, he tried to capture the sensation of flying the aircraft. According to his notes, taking the controls of a Zero felt less like operating a machine and more like gaining an extension of one's own body. He wrote that the fighter responded almost instinctively, as if reacting to intention rather than physical input. In contrast, he described American aircraft as powerful machines that behaved like heavy equipment, fast and durable, but blunt and unrefined. To him, U.S. fighters were built with the same philosophy as their automobiles, sturdy, over-engineered, and wasteful in weight. The Zero achieved its extraordinary capabilities because of a radically different design doctrine. Engineers relied on extra superduralumin, a classified aluminum alloy that made the airframe roughly 30% lighter than comparable American constructions. Almost every protective feature considered standard elsewhere was deliberately omitted. Pilots sat behind no armor plating. Fuel tanks lacked self-sealing systems. Even the onboard radio was frequently removed to cut a few additional pounds. In the Zero program, every gram was traded for maneuverability, and this ruthless pursuit of lightness defined the aircraft's strengths and its eventual weaknesses. Intelligence doubt and misjudgment. In early 1943, Japanese intelligence first received reports of a new American carrier fighter, the Grumman F6F Hellcat, through neutral Swedish channels. The specifications seemed so extreme that analysts doubted their authenticity. The documents claimed the U.S. fighter had a loaded weight of 12,186 pounds, more than double that of the Zero's roughly 5,800 pounds. The Hellcat's broad, 334-square-foot wings and its bulky radial engine added drag, yet it supposedly carried 2,400 rounds of ammunition, extensive armor plating, bullet-resistant glass, and self-sealing fuel tanks holding around 250 gallons. At Combined Fleet Headquarters, Captain Minoru Ginda, the strategist behind the Pearl Harbor operation, reviewed these figures. His assessment, later archived by the Japanese Defense Ministry, dismissed the aircraft as proof that the Americans still misunderstood air combat. Genda concluded that the U.S. was continuing its pattern of trying to compensate for inferior pilot training with sheer mechanical mass. According to his calculations, the Zero's wing loading of 22 pounds per foot squared produced a turning radius of about 612 feet, while the Hellcat's 36.5 pounds per foot squared suggested something above 900 feet. In the turning engagements that formed the backbone of Japanese fighter doctrine, he reasoned the new American machine would be at a hopeless disadvantage. First sight of the Hellcat, September 30th, 1943. Reality contradicted those assumptions. On September 30th, 1943, over Marcus Island, Petty Officer First Class Yoshio Fuku was flying escort for a reconnaissance aircraft when he observed 6 dark-painted fighters approaching from the southeast. His initial interpretation, recorded in his combat report, was that the shapes resembled B-25 bombers heading on an unusual course. But as the formation banked, their silhouette became unmistakable. A single-engine fighter with a large fuselage and wings that appeared too compact for its bulk. First encounter with a new U.S. fighter type, he wrote. His first impression was that the Americans had taken the airframe of a torpedo bomber and armed it like a fighter. Following standard doctrine, Fukui attempted to employ the Zero's superior turning ability. He dropped into a descending turn, expecting the heavier American aircraft to continue forward and allow him to slide neatly behind it. But what happened next contradicted every expectation Japanese pilots held. The Hellcat did not attempt to match the turn. Instead, it pitched sharply upward. Powered by the 2,000-horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp, around 700 horsepower more than the Zero's Nakajima Sakai engine, the aircraft climbed at an astonishing 3,500 feet per minute. Fukui tried to follow, but his airspeed bled away rapidly. By the time they reached 15,000 feet, the American fighter executed a clean hammerhead maneuver, one that seemed impossible for such a heavy platform, and pivoted straight down towards Fukui. At roughly 400 meters, the Hellcat opened fire. Fukui noted with alarm that the aircraft carried 6 machine guns, not 4 as intelligence had predicted. The density of fire was unlike anything he had previously encountered. In a burst lasting only a few seconds, 17 rounds struck his Zero. He survived only by deliberately dropping into a spin and using the uncontrolled descent to break contact. He managed to return to Marcus Island with his aircraft riddled and barely holding together. His wingman, Petty Officer Second Class Masao, never came back. The reconnaissance plane they were protecting was also lost. The first engagement had gone decisively to the Hellcat. The paradox of weight. Early October 1943. Just a few days later, on October 5, 1943, the United States launched an assault on Wake Island as part of Task Force 14's operations. In the battles that followed, the apparent contradiction at the heart of the Hellcat, its massive weight paired with unexpectedly dominant combat performance, became increasingly clear to Japanese commanders. The very mass they believed would cripple the fighter had instead given it durability, firepower, and the ability to fight in vertical maneuvers, an arena where the Zero could not hope to compete. The events over Marcus and Wake Islands marked the beginning of a shift in the Pacific Air War. Japanese assumptions about maneuver-based dogfighting were upended by a fighter that refused to play by the rules they had prepared for. And from that point onward, the Zero's long-held advantage in agility would steadily erode under the relentless momentum of American engineering. Lieutenant Yoshio of the 252nd Air Group launched a dozen Zero fighters to confront what initially looked like yet another small American harassment mission. For months, U.S. carriers had been sending out light, fast strikes that rarely lingered long enough for Japanese units to catch them. But on this occasion, the circumstances were unlike the familiar pattern. In his diary, pilot Shiga later described their climb. "We reached roughly 20,000 feet and leveled off. Beneath them, flying in 3 neat elements, were 12 F6S Hellcats." From the Japanese perspective, every tactical factor, height, initial position, and surprise, favored the attackers. The pilots expected an easy engagement, almost a formality. What followed instead overturned assumptions that had guided Japanese air combat thinking since the start of the war. As the Zero formation pitched downward toward the Americans, the Hellcats did not fan out in panic or attempt to engage in tight turning contests. They steadied their formation, dipped gently to gain speed, and preserved their momentum. The Japanese opened fire at extreme range, hoping sheer volume might produce a hit, but the American aircraft were built to endure punishment. The Hellcat's protection, over 200 pounds of armor around the cockpit, reinforced shielding for its oil system and fuel tanks designed to close up after being pierced, allowed the American pilots to take impacts that would have crippled a Zero. With their ammunition spent after repeated diving attacks, the Zero pilots found themselves out of position and low on options. The Hellcats, still fast and intact, initiated the counterblow. They climbed hard, exploiting an altitude band where the Zero's engine began to suffocate. At 25,000 feet, the F6F could still produce around 1,650 horsepower, while the Zero was struggling with nearly half of that output. "They fell upon us like hawks striking smaller birds," Shiga recorded. The Americans used their mass to gather overwhelming diving speed, delivered bursts from 6 heavy machine guns, and then pulled up out of danger before the Japanese could retaliate. 8 Zeros were destroyed. The Hellcats returned without a single loss. Observers later viewed this encounter as an early sign of what would be dubbed the Marianas Turkey Shoot. Briefing before the storm, November 11, 1943, Rabaul. At Rabaul, the 204th Air Group's pilots assembled to hear Lieutenant Commander To Tanemitsu speak. With 32 confirmed victories, Tanemitsu was among the few Japanese aviators who had repeatedly survived clashes with Hellcats. His message dismantled years of ingrained doctrine. "Erase what you think you understand about aerial battle," he warned. "The Americans have rewritten the terms." He explained that the F6F had never been intended to outturn the Zero. Instead, U.S. pilots employed an approach based on managing altitude and airspeed, what Western flyers called energy fighting. By staying fast and occupying advantageous height, Hellcat units made high-speed, one-pass attacks that denied Zero pilots the turning fight in which they excelled. Tanemitsu also emphasized the seamless cooperation between American pilots. They fought in coordinated pairs, one positioned above, one below, so that engaging one Hellcat often meant exposing oneself to the other. Their radios, once mocked by Japanese flyers as unnecessary dead weight, were the key to this teamwork. "We fly as lone swordsmen," he said. "They operate as a unified system." Technological disparity becomes visible. December 1943, Truk Lagoon. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the air officer who had once led the strike on Pearl Harbor, now spent his days evaluating damaged aircraft returning from combat. What he found underscored a widening technological gulf. Firepower alone told a stark story. The Hellcat's 6 Browning M2 guns together unleashed about 4,500 rounds per minute, each 50 caliber slug weighing roughly 46 grams and carrying energy in the thousands of foot-pounds. The Zero's rifle caliber 7.7 millimeter guns offered only a fraction of that destructive force. More troubling to Japanese commanders were reports coming in about American radar control. While Japanese pilots still relied entirely on human eyesight to locate enemy aircraft, Hellcats were being steered by operators aboard ships who could detect incoming formations from distances approaching 50 miles. Lieutenant Sadamu Kumachi recounted his first encounter with this new reality. "We were climbing through cloud when they struck. We never saw them approach. Hellcats dropped onto us from precisely the right angle, as if they knew every detail, our height, direction, and path. We were fighting as if blind against opponents who could see through the darkness." The human factor. January 1944. By early 1944, Japan faced a crisis in aircrew quality that threatened to collapse its aerial forces. Before the war, the Imperial Navy's pilot training program had been the most rigorous in the world. Naval aviators spent 3 years in training and typically entered combat with around 700 hours in the cockpit. Their Army counterparts logged at least 500. These pilots were highly practiced in aerobatics, marksmanship, instrument flying, and formation work, and were steeped in an ethos that treated aerial combat as a refined art. War attrition and shrinking fuel supplies shattered that system. By 1944, new naval pilots were graduating with about 300 hours, Army pilots with barely 200, and much of that was flown in unpowered gliders. Ammunition shortages meant trainees often fired no more than 50 practice rounds. Complex skills such as formation discipline, radio operation, and all-weather flying were increasingly skipped to push replacements to the front lines as fast as possible. Meanwhile, the United States was sending pilots into battle with roughly the same total hours Japanese pre-war trainees once held, around 300. But those hours were qualitatively richer. American flyers had fired thousands of rounds in training, mastered carrier landings under controlled conditions, and practiced energy tactics over vast, safe training ranges in states such as Texas. When they reached the Pacific, they were not merely replacements. They were fully prepared combat aviators. Lieutenant Commander Yoshihiro Hashimoto, who oversaw pilot training at Kasumagaira Naval Air Station, submitted a grim assessment shortly before his death. In his last written evaluation, he lamented that Japan was sending youth to confront seasoned opponents. His warning became painfully real when Ensign Yamamoto reached the front lines. Yamamoto had never discharged his aircraft's weapons while airborne. Training ammunition no longer existed. He had never flown after sunset. Fuel reserves were too limited for night sorties. His first encounter with American fighters ended less than 10 minutes after he entered combat airspace. The Formosa Revelation, 12 to 16 October 1944. During the American carrier offensive against Formosa, Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, commanding the Japanese Second Air Fleet, ordered virtually every available aircraft into the fight. Over 700 planes, including the final cohorts from Japan's training units, were thrown into the operation. Japanese headquarters initially celebrated what they believed was a crushing victory, announcing the destruction of dozens of American carriers and battleships and hundreds of enemy aircraft. The celebration did not survive contact with reality. Only when surviving pilots returned and the gun camera footage was reviewed did the truth emerge. The losses were catastrophic. The United States Navy had lost just 89 aircraft. Japan had lost more than 300 planes, and with them, nearly all pilots who still possessed meaningful combat experience. Lieutenant Sadaki Akamatsu, one of the few veterans who lived through the mission, would later describe the engagement as an almost mechanical slaughter. American F6F Hellcats, he recalled, were positioned across the sky at carefully calculated altitudes. Any attempt to climb or dive brought Japanese pilots directly into another layer of waiting fighters. He wrote that it felt less like an air battle and more like being processed through a system designed for elimination. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, 19 June 1944. 4 months earlier, the Japanese Navy had attempted to rebuild its carrier strike force for a decisive encounter in the Philippine Sea, Operation AGO. 9 Japanese carriers put forward roughly 450 aircraft, many flown by pilots who had trained urgently but insufficiently after earlier losses. Facing them was Task Force 58, 15 American carriers and nearly 1,000 aircraft, almost half of them Hellcats. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa dispatched 4 attack waves, confident that Japanese aircraft range and pilot tradition would compensate for American numbers. The first strike group lifted off at 0830, 69 aircraft in total. Long-range American radar detected the formation while it was still hundreds of miles away, and controllers vectored intercepting fighters directly into the perfect engagement position. Higher altitude, better visibility, and coming from directions the Japanese aircraft struggled to monitor. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, leading part of the Japanese escort, reported seeing the American fighters arrayed in multiple vertical layers, a formation he described as a barrier of metal. His group was several thousand feet lower. The clash lasted only minutes. 42 of the 69 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. Commander David McCampbell, Air Group Commander aboard USS Essex, shot down 7 enemy aircraft in one day, while his wingman, Lieutenant Roy Rushing, downed 6 more. McCampbell later summarized the tactical imbalance simply: American fighters refused to be drawn into turning contests. They attacked from altitude, climbed back into the sun, and struck again while Japanese planes stalled, trying to follow. By nightfall, Japan had lost more than 300 carrier aircraft as well as 50 land-based planes. The United States lost 30 aircraft in total, including operational mishaps. The term "turkey shoot" was coined that evening in American ready rooms, a dark expression reflecting how defenseless the Japanese formations had seemed. The Leyte Gulf Record, 24 October 1944. During the Battle of Leyte Gulf, McCampbell again entered the historical record. Leading a group of 7 Hellcats from the Essex, he intercepted a large force of Japanese aircraft, around 60, advancing on the American fleet. The ensuing dogfight lasted more than an hour. McCampbell personally shot down 9 aircraft, a mix of fighters and bombers, before exhausting his ammunition supply. His wingman added another 6 kills. Remarkably, all 7 Hellcats returned unharmed. This action symbolized the near-total collapse of Japanese air power. Small, well-coordinated American formations could now break up entire Japanese strike groups. McCampbell's 2 ace-in-a-day performances, 7 kills in June and 9 in October, earned him the Medal of Honor and further solidified the Hellcats' reputation as the dominant fighter of the Pacific War. Psychological and strategic breakdown. The combined impact of the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf battles shattered the morale of many Japanese aviators. Military psychologists in Japan later referred to the phenomenon as Hellcat syndrome, a term meant to capture the sense of futility pilots felt when facing the radar-guided, systematized American air defense network. Admiral Ozawa, in his own post-battle analysis, admitted that American direction and control procedures had transformed aerial combat into something resembling automated warfare. In his view, Japanese pilots were no longer battling individual adversaries, but an integrated machine composed of radar operators, controllers, and disciplined fighter units. As casualties mounted, Japan's ability to train replacements disintegrated. By early 1945, new Navy pilots often received barely 50 hours of total flight instruction, and Army pilots only slightly more. Kamikaze trainees, rushed into service as the situation deteriorated, sometimes logged less than a week of actual flight time before being sent into action. Toward the final battles, Okinawa, 1945. These conditions set the stage for the desperate months ahead, culminating in the brutal air-sea struggle around Okinawa from April to June 1945. By this phase of the war, Japan's air arm existed in name more than in capability, relying heavily on minimally trained aviators and last-ditch tactics born from dwindling resources and the collapse of long-term operational planning. During Operation Iceberg, the battle for Okinawa turned into one of the most intense air defense struggles the U.S. Navy had ever faced. Japanese forces launched nearly 1,900 kamikaze sorties against the American fleet massed offshore. In this environment, the F6F Hellcat evolved from a standard carrier fighter into a primary shield against waves of pilots who no longer expected to return from their missions. Among the many aviators who fought there, Lieutenant Eugene Valencia quickly became known for leading a hard-hitting group of Hellcat fighter pilots, often referred to informally as his flying circus. Over the course of the Okinawa campaign, Valencia and his division were credited with 23 enemy aircraft destroyed. What made his unit exceptional was not just marksmanship, but the tactical method they developed for breaking apart Japanese formations. Valencia described their approach as the mowing machine. In this system, 4 Hellcats flew side by side, each roughly 100 yards apart, charging through enemy groups at high speed. Every pilot focused on his own slice of the sky. After a single devastating pass, the group would climb back into position and sweep through again. Against Japanese pilots, already straining under heavy losses and limited training, these coordinated attacks made older dogfighting habits effectively suicidal. The scale of the campaign underscored the imbalance. Hellcat pilots flew over 38,000 combat sorties around Okinawa and claimed 2,351 aerial victories while losing 249 aircraft, a kill ratio of roughly 9.5 to 1. Even more consequential, U.S. fighters managed to stop about 4 out of every 5 kamikaze aircraft before they could reach American ships. Technological divide. By 1945, the gap between American and Japanese aviation technology had widened to the point that it could no longer be remedied with training or bravery. The later Hellcat variants, such as the F6F5, integrated a collection of upgrades, water injection systems that pushed the engine to around 2,200 horsepower, launch mounts for zero-length rockets, stronger armor protection, and a K-14 computing gun sight, which automatically calculated lead angles for deflection shooting. Together, these improvements turned the Hellcat into one of the most lethal fighter platforms of the war. The disparity became evident even to Japan's most respected aces. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, one of the few surviving veterans of the early Pacific Air War, first encountered Hellcats in mid-1944. Although credited officially with 28 victories, modern research suggests closer to 15. Sakai had unmatched combat experience. Yet during his initial clash with the new American fighter, he was nearly shot down. In his memoir, Sakai recounted performing every maneuver he had perfected across more than 200 engagements, tight turns, climbing rolls, split-S dives, only to find the Hellcat hanging behind him with unsettling ease. He escaped only because the U.S. pilot failed to jettison an external fuel tank before entering combat, a mistake that slowed the American aircraft just enough for Sakai to slip away. Human cost and final accounting. By the time the war ended, the Hellcat's impact on the air war was unmistakable. U.S. Navy and Marine Corps pilots flying the type recorded 52,223 confirmed aerial victories, Only 270 Hellcats were lost to enemy fighters, yielding a staggering 19.3 to 1 kill ratio. The aircraft was responsible for producing over 300 American aces, and it accounted for roughly 3/4 of all air-to-air victories achieved by the U.S. Navy. Japan's losses were far more devastating. Out of approximately 18,000 naval aviators who had entered the war, fewer than 100 experienced combat pilots were still alive by August 1945. Years of attrition, combined with rushed training and increasingly desperate missions, hollowed out what had once been the most formidable naval air arm in the world. The logic of kamikaze warfare. Japan's shift towards deliberate suicide attacks was in many ways an acknowledgement that conventional air combat against aircraft like the Hellcat no longer offered a viable path to success. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, regarded as the architect of the kamikaze strategy, explained its grim arithmetic plainly. A Zero attempting a standard attack on a U.S. carrier had virtually no chance of scoring a hit. American fighters would almost certainly intercept it. But if the aircraft were used as a piloted bomb, the likelihood of striking a ship could increase dramatically, perhaps to around 30%. To Onishi, the pilot would die either way. The kamikaze method simply ensured his death would achieve something tactically measurable. The transition was visible almost immediately. On October 25, 1944, Ace Hiroyoshi Nishizawa escorted the first officially sanctioned kamikaze attack, led by Lieutenant Yukio Seki. Scoring what became his 86th and 87th aerial victories, both Hellcats. But fate turned quickly. The following day, October 26th, Nishizawa, traveling unarmed as a passenger aboard a transport aircraft, was shot down by Hellcats from VF-14. Japan's most celebrated fighter pilot perished without the cockpit that had defined him, downed by the same aircraft he had temporarily outmatched only hours earlier. The final testimony, August 15, 1945. When Emperor Hirohito's voice finally reached the Japanese population on August 15, 1945, announcing that the war must end, the message carried across bases that were already shadows of what they had been. At Atsugi Airfield, Captain Minoru Genda, who had long criticized the American Hellcat as a machine that relied on brute force rather than elegance, sat silently as the broadcast crackled through loudspeakers. Around him were the last fragments of Japan's naval air arm, exhausted instructors, teenage aviators who barely had 40 hours of flying behind them, and fighters patched together from scavenged components. Many aircraft sat immobile with almost no fuel, a symbol of a war sustained on diminishing resources. The last kill of the Pacific War. That very afternoon, far from Atsugi, Ensign Clarence Moore of VF-31 was airborne from the carrier USS Bellawood. Sometime after 2 p.m., he encountered a lone Yokosuka D-4 wide Judy dive bomber heading toward the American fleet. The Japanese pilot, evidently unaware that his nation had surrendered, maintained course without hesitation. Moore closed in and fired 2 brief bursts from the 6.5 caliber guns of his F6F Hellcat. The Judy spiraled down, marking the final aerial victory of the Second World War. With that engagement, the Pacific Air War ended exactly as it had been fought: fast, lethal, and defined by machines of radically unequal industrial worlds. Arrival of the occupiers, September 1945. A few weeks later, Atsugi Airfield became the stage for a very different moment. The first American aircraft to touch down after the surrender were 12 F6F Hellcats from USS Yorktown. Japanese pilots, mechanics, and ground crews gathered along the runway, drawn by curiosity toward the fighter that had dominated them for years. Among the American contingent was Lieutenant Robert Vasu, a veteran with 19 aerial victories. To demonstrate the Hellcat's performance, he took off and carried out a casual routine of loops, rolls, and steep climbs, maneuvers that would have pushed the lightly built Zero to structural limits or worse. The spectators watched in stunned silence. Through an interpreter, Vasu explained almost offhandedly that what they had just seen barely scratched the aircraft's combat capability. With water injection engaged, the engine produced roughly 20% more power, and the airframe was engineered to withstand stresses up to 13 Gs. He added that he had never come close to breaking one. Engineering autopsy of a lost war. After the war, Japanese engineers examined captured Hellcats in meticulous detail. Their findings were startling. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 power plant contained nearly 2,800 precision-machined components, all fully interchangeable from one engine to another, a concept made possible only by high-volume exact tolerance manufacturing. By contrast, the Nakajima Sakae engine that powered the Zero required extensive hand-fitting. Parts varied subtly from engine to engine, making interchangeability impossible. Professor Jiro Horikoshi, the chief designer of the Zero, participated in these studies. His assessment was sobering. In his view, Japan had built a superb fighter for the world of 1941, relying on craftsmanship and lightweight philosophy, while the United States developed a comprehensive industrial system capable of producing the aircraft needed for 1945. As he remarked later, Japan had refined the sword, while America had mastered the factory. The manufacturing machine. Grumman's approach to building the Hellcat became a strategic advantage of its own. At the company's Bethpage, New York facility, production lines operated without pause, 24 hours a day, every day of the week. At full tempo, a completed Hellcat rolled off the line every single hour. Over the span of 30 months, the factory produced 12,275 aircraft, a volume that Japanese planners had assumed was impossible. The contrast in national production capacity underscored the overwhelming disparity. Japan assembled roughly 5,100 fighters of all types in 1944, while the United States produced more than 35,000 fighters that same year. American factories employed innovations unfamiliar to Japanese observers: color-coded assembly instructions, standardized modular components, rotating shifts that kept production continuous, and quality control systems that maintained consistency despite astonishing speed. A strategic transformation at sea. Beyond tactical performance, the Hellcat changed the very nature of carrier warfare. Before the war, naval strategists believed that carriers were vulnerable platforms that needed to strike first or risk destruction. The Hellcat overturned this assumption. Its rugged construction, high speed, and firepower allowed U.S. task forces to defend themselves against virtually any air assault. Admiral Mark Mitcher, leader of Task Force 58, recognized this shift and embraced it wholeheartedly. With confidence, he remarked that his carriers no longer needed to locate the enemy first. American pilots could simply allow incoming attacks to approach, knowing the Hellcats would handle them at the fleet's convenience. This newfound security enabled U.S. carriers to remain off hostile coastlines for weeks at a time, projecting constant offensive pressure while remaining effectively immune to aerial attack beneath their protective Hellcat umbrella. A clash of mindsets. More than a technical matchup, the arrival of the F6F Hellcat exposed a fundamental conflict between two worldviews. Japanese military aviation had grown out of a samurai-influenced ethos that celebrated individual mastery, spiritual resolve, and the willingness to die without hesitation. By contrast, the Hellcat represented something entirely different, an industrial, methodical, efficiency-driven philosophy designed to keep its pilots alive and to overwhelm the enemy with organization rather than mystique.
This divide wasn't merely cultural, it had tactical consequences. Japanese aviators often understood what the Hellcat was doing in the air, but the strategic logic behind those maneuvers was alien to their training. A doctrine that encouraged breaking off from a losing engagement, a cornerstone of Hellcat operations, stood in direct opposition to the Bushido-infused mentality that saw disengagement as dishonor. Even when the Japanese recognized the effectiveness of such tactics, their system and psychology left them unable to fully adapt.
Reflections from those who fought. In 1962, when the U.S. Navy convened a major symposium to evaluate air combat in the Pacific War, American and Japanese veterans found themselves revisiting battles with decades of hindsight. Captain David McCampbell, America's top naval ace with 34 confirmed victories, summed up his view with blunt clarity. The Hellcat won the Pacific from the sky. It broke the backbone of Japanese air power and made our eventual success unavoidable. Sitting across from him, legendary Japanese ace Saburo Sakai offered a different angle. He insisted that the Zero remained an extraordinary fighter aircraft, but acknowledged that the Hellcat was part of a larger system, one that fused machinery, doctrine, training, and industrial strength into a single devastating whole. "We thought we were in a duel," he remarked. "They were fighting with an entire ecosystem behind them. We walked into a contest carrying swords, while they arrived with an armory." The numbers that tell the story. The Hellcat's supremacy can be illustrated with stark statistics. Its overall kill ratio hovered around 19-1, and against the Zero specifically, it maintained an approximate 13-1 advantage. Over just 2.5 years, the United States produced more than 12,000 Hellcats, while Japan built roughly 6,000 Zeros during the final phase of the war, from 1943 to 1945. American pilot training programs turned out over 5,000 aviators ready to handle the Hellcat. By the summer of 1945, Japan could field fewer than 100 fully combat-capable fighter pilots. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, who had led Japan's forces during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, later admitted that the Japanese command failed to grasp what the Hellcat represented, an outward expression of an entire nation's industrial and organizational capacity. He said, "We dismissed it, not realizing it signaled a new era of warfare. By the time the truth was visible, our air arm was already gone." A final appraisal. Saburo Sakai lived into the year 2000, and near the end of his life, he was once again asked for his perspective on the Hellcat. His answer distilled decades of reflection. The Zero, he said, had once symbolized Japan's ascent as a naval aviation power, but the Hellcat demonstrated the limits of Japan's ambition. It forced Japanese pilots to understand, often too late, that courage and tradition were not substitutes for modern systems and scalable industry. Sakai added a quietly devastating remark. Any Japanese pilot who walked away from the war did so because a Hellcat pilot decided not to finish the job. For him, that imbalance, not just in machinery, but in control over survival, was the harshest truth of all.
The machine that changed the balance. When the Hellcat entered operational service, it weighed nearly twice as much as the Zero. It carried armor the Zero never possessed, flew with an engine Japan could not mass-produce, and mounted weaponry that outmatched anything the Japanese could field. It worked hand-in-hand with radar systems the Japanese could neither detect nor replicate, and its pilots arrived with a depth and consistency of training that Japan could no longer hope to match. And perhaps most importantly, the Hellcat rolled off American production lines in quantities that Japan simply could not comprehend. Early in the war, many Japanese pilots mocked the Hellcat's bulk, believing it to be clumsy. What they failed to recognize was that every pound of additional weight represented deliberate protection, proof of a democratic industrial power willing and able to safeguard the men who flew its aircraft. Their laughter, in many cases, was followed by farewell letters home, by desperate kamikaze attacks, and by the realization that the era of lightly built, lightly protected fighters was ending. In the end, the Hellcat didn't merely outperform the Zero, it dismantled the ideology that had shaped Japanese air strategy for years. It proved that in modern conflict, the nation capable of constructing an integrated, technologically advanced combat system would ultimately overcome one that relied on personal valor alone. Japanese pilots may have laughed at the Hellcat when it first appeared, but the Hellcat, unfailingly and decisively, delivered the final answer.